everyone, my name is Max Haas. I'm a bass player based in Denver, Colorado. I currently play with a band called Half Max. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the equipment that I use and the sounds that I like to get out of my basses. And hopefully it's helpful for those of you who've been playing for a few years, those of you who just started playing, and maybe even some other advanced players will find a couple things in these videos that they'll think is a little helpful too. So, hope you enjoy. First up, of course, is the axe itself. My go-to bass these days is a 6-string bass. I'm playing an ESP LTD. I don't even know the model number. Oh, it's right here, the B206SM. 6 strings gives me the low B and the high C. Though I keep all my basses tuned down half a step, so this is actually a B flat and this is a B. But it gives me a lot of range to work with to play, the low octaves of some low D and C sharp notes when I need, but also gives me some really high range to work with when I want to solo or play little chords or other things like that. So I've been really enjoying this bass. I was first inspired to start playing it when I had a church gig because I realized I needed that low string. And when I looked into 5-string basses, I was like, why not 6? Gives me more options, So from the bass, I then run out to my pedal board, where the first thing that I plug in is my tuner pedal. I'm done using the clip-on snark tuners because those things just die after a few months and they're just really not worth it. And then I go into a limiter enhancer, which just gives me a little bit of boost for gigs so that there's a little more stable volume level throughout. And then I'm running into an octave pedal, Boss OC5, which has so many options. I'll play around with that a little bit later. Then I've got a chorus pedal, an old Dan Electro chorus pedal that I bought when I was in high school. Then a distortion pedal, a volume pedal. I find that's really helpful to have sort of a set level for most of the tunes that I'm playing, but every once in a while I need a little boost for a solo or a fill or something like that. And it's a lot easier, in my opinion, to use the volume pedal than to constantly be messing with the volume knobs on the bass itself. And then the very last thing that I go out through a DI, just in case the venue I'm playing at needs that DI signal. Though I do have a DI on my amp, so sometimes I just go with that instead. And finally, everything runs through a Gallien-Kruger MB210, the Backline series. This particular model I bought in 2009, and it's been serving me well all these years ever since. So that's the basic rundown. Now I'll give you a little sort of A-B comparison of what this sounds like. So this is no pedals except the limiter enhancer. And pretty even tone on the bass itself. This has got active pickups with 3-band EQ, pickup selection, and volume. I usually keep this pickup selector right in the middle, pretty much all the EQ right in the middle. Though right now I've got the treble dialed pretty far down, just a little bit blended in, and the mid-range is up just a little off 50%. So this is what that sounds like. And just so you can see what happens when you take the limiter off, pretty subtle difference. You don't necessarily notice it in the studio setting when the bass is by itself, but on a gig you'll find, especially if there's a keyboard, there's a kick drum, other things like that, the bass can sometimes get lost or start to sound a little bit muddy with those other low frequencies. So the limiter kind of just squeezes that tone a little bit and gives you a nice little boost. Find that it kind of pushes the mid-range tones a little bit, but I like that sound. I grew up on Victor Wooten and Flea and players like that, so the mid-range growly sound has always kind of been part of my sound because of that. But yeah, so we've got the clean, and with this 6-string, can get really high up, so the octave pedal can be really fun there because I can be way up here on the neck and still get some nice bass tones out of it. If you've never messed with an octave pedal, especially as a bassist, it's one of my absolute favorites. In fact, I had been wanting an octave pedal for years before I finally got one. And there's so many cool things you can do. You know, you can dial down the direct tone, right? So you're going to get this coming through, or you can take that off completely and you get this weird sort of synth bass kind of sound out of it. Takes all the treble out because you're actually not getting any of the signal from your pickups there. You're just getting the pedals onboard synthesis playing that lower octave bass note underneath it. But if you take out that direct dry signal, all you're left with is that synth tone, so it can sound really cool. The chorus pedal is just kind of a classic, especially works well when I'm going, you know, bridge pickup, a little more mid-rangey. It really helps the chorus pedal cut through. So you're ever going for that Jocko sound, or, you know, I'll play the fretless here in a second. You'll hear that chorus pedal just seems almost instrumental to the sound itself. But that one's always fun for soloing and whatnot, and I sometimes like to combine it with the other pedals, so, you know, chorus and octave together can sound pretty cool. Let's bring that direct back up. You get the idea. And then I've got this distortion. It's kind of an all-purpose distortion, probably meant for guitar. But it's got a nice sound, you know, so I like using that every once in a while if it's a particularly intense moment in a solo or something like that, and just really need the bass to sound different than it's been sounding all night. It's a nice layer to add. And, you know, I've got it cranked up a little bit because it sounds too loud right now relative to the dry signal, but as soon as you get on a gig, you realize distortion pedals eat your low end, and all of a sudden nobody can hear the bass. So I cranked the distortion up a little bit so that with all the other sounds of the drum kit, the guitar, the keyboard, and whatnot, switching to distortion doesn't create that effect of the bass just totally dropping out. And then I've got this great volume pedal from Ernie Ball. I went with the active version that plugs in, though they do make a passive version. But the active version gives you the option to set a floor for your minimum. So right now, even though I've got the pedal all the way back, I still have a little bit of signal coming through because I don't want to cut the bass sound off completely. What I typically do for gigs, I keep it at about 70, 80%. So when I'm playing a groove, I've got a pretty good volume level dialed in, and then when the time comes I need to play a solo, I just step on it so that it goes all the way up to 100%, and hopefully the cables aren't getting in the way. And then that gives me a little bit more so that the bass cuts through for solos. So that's my pedal board situation. I've got a lot of empty space on there, so I'm hoping to get an envelope filter someday or something like that. I did have a wah pedal, but it's just so heavy and bulky that I decided to get rid of it. So that's the effects in the amp. I'm probably not going to mess with the tone controls on the amp too much, just to kind of keep things consistent throughout the video. But let me show you a couple different tones that I get on just this bass. And then I'll switch to these other two basses so you can hear the differences between active and passive pickups, flat wound strings and round wound strings, and also the sort of classic Fender J bass pickups versus P bass pickups versus active pickups. A lot of different variety and tones you get from those, but it helps to kind of hear them side by side to really understand what those differences are. So right here on this bass, like I said, you've got the 3-band EQ. We've got the low, the mid, and the high volume here, pickup selection here. And so when I'm in the middle with pretty flat EQ, you're gonna get, a pretty classic active bass sound that's used, especially with these 5 and 6 string basses. You hear that in funk, in gospel, even in metal music too. So I'm playing right in between the two pickups. Everything's flat EQ-wise, and both pickups are giving me the, about equal signal. So without changing the EQ, if I switch to just the bridge pickup, you get a tone that cuts through a little bit more, right? You get a little bit more of that mid-range. And what helps when you do that is to play closer to the bridge too, because then you're getting more string tension there, and it's going to give it that sharper sound as you pick the notes. And again, that's no EQ changes, but one thing I like to do when I'm on this bridge pickup is I'll take this mid-range and I'll turn that up a little bit. And with these active pickups, you'll notice it's a huge difference. You hear it especially up here higher on the neck. So that helps a lot for solos, a tone that cuts through, especially if you've got a keyboardist playing with some kind of Rhodes or whirly or other sort of EP kind of sound. You're gonna have a lot of bass tones in there, a lot of bass overtones. And if the bass is trying to solo over that, you want that to cut through. Even if you're playing lower notes, that mid-range of the bridge pickup and playing closer to the bridge with the mid-range cranked up a little bit is gonna help that cut through. So I'll flatten out the EQ again, and I'll go back to the middle. What I like to do, instead of going, flat with the treble, because these pickups can be a little hot on the treble end. It's a little too bright and sharp for what I typically like, even with these old strings. So I'll take the treble down most of the way and then just add a little bit back in. And I find it still gives you plenty of that high end, but it just takes a little bit of that harsh edge off of it. Sometimes I'll turn up the low a little bit too, because when I'm playing grooves, especially here on like the E string, I just really want you to feel the bass. I want it to lock in with the kick drum. I want it to sound present in the mix with the other instruments. I'm never one to treat the bass as something that needs to be barely heard, Yes, we're there in the background as bassists, right? We're there to support the rest of the band, kind of hold the different parts of the music together, but that doesn't mean that the bass needs to be invisible either, right? So, with the low end especially, using the 6-string bass with this low B flat string that I've got on it, having that extra low end boost is nice. And with this active EQ that these pickups have, it really does give it that pretty noticeable bump. So going the other direction, sometimes you might want a really, really smooth sound, or really fat, warm tone. And that's where switching to this neck pickup, or at least the pickup that's closer to the neck, will really help. And similarly, if you're gonna switch to this pickup, you're kind of not doing much by keeping your hand down here. So you got a little looser string tension when you're a little farther away from the bridge. So the combination of using this pickup and having your plucking fingers in this part of the string will give you sort of that looser, warmer, fatter tone with the bass, right? So just to compare, we're gonna play here. And I did turn the treble all the way down too, so you don't hear really much of that brightness at all. You can take that same figure, right? And if I switch back to this other pickup, bring up the mid-range, same bass line, but it sounds like two different songs, right? Because it's totally different vibe, So we'll move on to another bass. That's kind of a little rundown of what you can do with these active pickups and different sounds that you can get. But I'm going to show you what passive pickups on a flat wound strings sounds like. All right, so I've switched to my 4-string flat wound string bass. I say that because I have owned this bass the longest of any of my instruments, except for maybe my acoustic guitar. Bought this bass when I was in 10th grade, which would be not quite 20 years ago, but definitely getting close to that. And it's a Washburn XB102 that used to have this really terrible camo pattern on it. I got it refinished, and when I got it refinished, I also upgraded the pickups, but I wanted to keep it passive pickups, didn't want to deal with any batteries, didn't want to have to, drill out or mill out any holes from the back. Kept it with the pickups that already fit in these spaces. With one precision pickup and one jazz pickup. But these flat wound strings have been on this bass for probably 15 years. And when I got the bass refinished and upgraded the pickups, I said, let's keep the old strings on it because I wanted that flat wound tone. So for those who are not familiar, I'll just play a little bit so you can hear that flat wound sound. And so, that's just pretty neutral, right? I'm kind of using pickup selector here. Is got both pickups going, volume's up pretty much all the way. And again, I've kind of got the treble dialed back a little bit, but that's sort of the sound that you want when you've got flat wounds, right? So think of some old Motown and Stax records, especially the stuff that James Jamerson played on. Flat wound strings pretty much across the board, and it gives you that nice, warm, kind of vintage tone to it. And so with these passive pickups, there's actually a pretty big difference in sound between the P pickup and the J pickup. The P pickup is a humbucker, and so it's going to have that fatter, meatier tone that you typically expect out of humbuckers. And then the J pickup is a single coil. These are actually Aguilar's version of those pickups. And you're going to get a very different sound out of each of those. So without changing the pickup selection, I'm just going to bring the treble in a little bit, and this knob sort of does double duty as the tone knob, so to speak, and is also to some extent sort of volume for this J pickup. And I'm sure the guy who wired my bass would tell me that I'm wrong about that, but that's at least my understanding of how this bass works. So bring that up a little bit more and you hear there's a little bit more treble there, right? You can hear the sound of my fingers picking the strings. But if I were to play down here at the neck and maybe I'll switch to, or down here at the bridge and I switch to the bridge pickup, similar thing with the other bass, right? You can hear how much sharper and how much more that really cuts through. And then if I switch the other way and go with the P pickup, maybe move my fingers closer to where that pickup is. Much thicker, warmer sound, right? And I can even add to that by taking the treble down all the way. So when you want that really warm sound, you don't want too much definition in the sound. Maybe you're playing the type of music where the bass does have a little bit more of a back seat, like maybe it's some classic rock or some country or something like that, where the bass doesn't need to be super in your face the way it is with funk and other related styles. You might want that warm, just P-bass sound. And especially if you're playing bass lines that aren't too busy, where you just play one note at a time, some whole notes, some quarter notes, things like that. You don't necessarily need that clarity that would come with something like active pickups where you're playing a more complicated line. So P pickups with treble all the way down can be a really good sound for some things. I would say that I rarely use that myself, but I like having the options and knowing what each of the basses can do. So now I'll switch to my fretless bass, which also happens to be a Fender jazz bass, so it has that classic Fender J bass tone that you'll hear in just a second. So now I've got my fretless bass. This is a Squire model of a Fender jazz bass. Bought this from a friend who was kind enough to ship it to me. And I'm doing something a little unconventional for fretless basses, which is that I'm using round wound strings on this. So even though it's got that fretless sound, it can be a little edgy when I want it to be too. Flat wound strings on a fretless is kind of that classic sound. I might do that eventually on this bass, but for now I kind of like how the round wounds feel and how they sound on this thing. One thing I wanted to point out is that on all of my basses I have these great little Velcro straps. They have a little, almost terry cloth towel-like material here on the surface that faces the strings, and then you just strap this on. And basically it helps prevent any unwanted ringing of open strings, but also can be fun for sliding up the neck and kind of deadening all of the strings while you're playing a groove. First saw something like this when I was getting started playing bass. I saw the Victor Wooten would sometimes do something like that on his bass, but his brother Reggie, the guitarist, would actually put little sweatbands, wrist sweatbands, and sometimes would have more than one, or sometimes he'd use hair scrunchies. And you'd see him keep one there and have another one there, and he'd do all this crazy tapping and stuff. And these actually do help for that type of thing a lot because they prevent that extra ringing of strings. But then I noticed a lot of other bassists more recently have been using these, keeping them usually down here, but every once in a while slide them up. And again, you're playing one of those fat like R&B grooves or funk grooves where you really want that sort of deadened bass sound to it. This helps with that. And as you notice, I have them on all of my basses. The only bass I don't use it on is my upright, but for obvious reasons. And I would say that on the fretless, it probably helps even more because you don't have the frets to work with, and sometimes you might miss the spot where your intonation is perfectly right. And so having something to kind of deaden those extra rings, extra vibrations, helps just with your overall sound. So here on this fretless, obviously you've got the fact that there's no frets, so you can get these smooth glissandos. But it's also a Fender J bass, right? So they've got these fun, funky pickup covers, but underneath there's just standard Fender single coil J bass pickups. And so the controls on this are a little bit different than the other basses. Unlike my old Washburn, where it's really just volume and tone / other pickup volume, this actually has two independent volume controls. So this volume knob goes 0 to 100 for the neck pickup, and then this volume knob is 0 to 100 for the bridge pickup. And then you've got this tone knob that brings in quite a bit more treble depending on how much you crank it up. So with the tone knob all the way down, you have a nice, smooth, warm kind of sound. Crank up the tone knob all the way the other way. Gives you all that gritty, grimy edge that you get from these round wound strings. And then of course, if I want to accentuate that even more, I would turn the neck pickup volume down all the way so that I'm only using this pickup here. And that's giving me just that bridge pickup sound. One thing that's really important with fretless basses is obviously getting your intonation right. So even though this doesn't have frets, Fender was kind enough to still include the lines where the frets would be, which helps a lot. But sometimes on a gig, when there's not much light, you can't see those lines anyway. It's really important to make sure you're in the right place on a fretless bass. Just like playing an upright, intonation is super, super important because the frets aren't there to help you with it. So typically you want to play with your finger as close to that fret marker as possible. That's going to give you the clearest, purest tone and also the most accurate note. So, you know, right here is a B flat because I'm tuned down half a step. And if I play it right here near the fret, I'm going to get something that's pretty close to a B flat. I can even check it with my tuner. And right there on the fret line is pretty much in tune. But if I slide my finger just even a quarter of an inch down this way, it's slightly flat. And you can see that on the tuner as well, that it's slightly flat, probably about 25%. And then of course, if you're coming down toward this other fret, you're gonna start getting, it's getting into being an A, but there's nothing separating that, right? So you have to be really mindful of where you put your fingers. Another thing on fretless that helps just with the overall sound is using vibrato. If you ever watch classical players, you'll see that vibrato is happening all the time on stringed instruments. It not only helps with the sustain, but it just makes the sound a little more interesting too. So if I'm playing a quick line, just makes it a little more interesting than playing. Right? Seems a little thin, a little kind of not as interesting. So the vibrato can give you a little bit of soul to your sound. And I did just want to point out the effects pedals on a fretless can add to your sound. So very common for fretless players to incorporate a chorus pedal. And of course, you know, the more treble you bring into the sound, the more you'll notice that chorus effect. So that's about all I've got when it comes to tones, pickups, and equipment. Hopefully this was helpful for people who are just starting out with the instrument, making their way through a few years in, and even maybe some more experienced players. You know, I don't really think there's any one right way to go about this. And for a long time, I never used the pedal board. I just, you know, went dry signal into the amp and that was it. But over the years, I've found, especially playing gigs more often, that having a consistent sound, having, you know, your stuff organized, because when I did start using pedals more often, I didn't have a pedal board, and carrying those around in a bag and then setting them up every gig was always really annoying. And so I found that little adjustments can be really good to just sort of streamline the process. It helps you feel a little bit more professional in your approach to things. And I think it does save you time and helps you create a really good sound as well.